Hello, everyone. I wanted to take the opportunity to brief you on some of the key themes from this first week that we have together. And this is chapter one of Enterprise Systems for Management. What are enterprise systems? Notice there's a couple of key words here: enterprise systems and also management. Enterprise systems are the means by which most companies are managed today. There's also a key word there, and that's management. You are learning or becoming exposed to in this course information systems, but always from the perspective of management. What's important for managers to know? Managers do not necessarily have to know how to write code or configure networks, but they should be aware of what systems can do for them in terms of supporting how they manage the company, give them information for making decisions. There's a lot of key important principles that managers should be aware of, especially today in the information age in which we live. So let's take a look at some of the highlights. First of all, early ERP implementation didn't understand the magnitude of issues an organization has to consider before, during, and after implementation. I can say that is very, very true. I have been through ERP system implementations that ended up taking considerable time and money, and after it was all over, guess what? Nothing really changed. So it's possible to spend a lot of money and end up with a new system that pretty much functions like the old system. And it's complicated. You want to get end users, people who actually use the system, to get involved in providing input prior to configuring and installing the new system, but everyone's busy and no one really seems to have the time or want to think through the issues that need to be thought through until, of course, you declare that the system is implemented, and then everyone has an opinion on how it should have been done. So it really is a challenge to get the people who use the system involved and deeply involved at an early stage. Okay, and so ERP systems are different from just individual applications. And you can't take shortcuts. The more forethought, the more involvement you have up front, the better it goes. They become very complicated, and they address multiple levels of management. So like strategic, mid-management, and operational. Operational is at the level where work actually gets done. Mid-management is coordinating the efforts of the lower levels and reporting. And strategic, you need a much more holistic view of the organization, and you have as much of an external view as you do an internal view. You have to evaluate the strategic macro environment and consider how you're going to best position your company. And doing that requires a lot of insights as to how your company is performing today, and enterprise systems help you do that. They do that through all the modules that are associated with an enterprise resource system. Now, in the early days of information systems, there were different systems for each function, and not every function had a supporting complete system. And I lived through this because my first job in industry was in the early 80s. And I can remember at that time we had an accounting application, and we had data entry people entering in invoices, money that came in, inputting it into the accounting system. And there was also a manufacturing system. There was little else outside of that, and it was really focused on taking the drudgery out of accounting and the drudgery out of managing inventory. There weren't other modules like you see here for the overall operations or customer service. Notice, though, that if you have a number of different applications and you've got some functions without applications, and they all tend to have their own operating systems and databases, it's very difficult to get a holistic picture of the entire company. Like I've worked at companies that were built through acquisitions, and they had different systems. And what happens is when you have different applications and you don't have a common database, you end up having to create Excel reports and try to merge data from one application with another, and it doesn't really come together very well. But imagine how powerful it would be if all the functions of the organization had their application, but the data was shared so you can be aware of what's going on at all levels of the organization. Also, keep in mind, the lower you go in the organization, the more structured your decisions are going to be. You're getting work done, you have to decide what to do and how to do it. Management control level has more choices, so the decisions are less structured. They become less routine. If you're the CEO of the company, you're making decisions about strategy, and you're dealing with a high degree of ambiguity, so it's a lot more unstructured than the lowest level. Okay, so I will give you a good example from Panasonic. Over time, information systems created a hodgepodge of independent, non-integrated systems. For example, in Panasonic, this company was organized with semi-autonomous business units throughout the world. And as it grew, and they were pretty much allowed to make their own decisions, and information systems were more or less an afterthought, very few common systems. Then Panasonic reached a stage where it's a multi-billion-dollar company, an annual turnover, but they don't have systems that can really talk to each other or integrate well with each other. And I remember they were trying to cob this together at Panasonic, and we were just even trying to send an email to corporate. We were noting the hundreds of steps of systems that this simple email, had to go through to get to corporate headquarters because of this big hodgepodge that was created. So remember, strategy is a top-down function. So the CEO of the company has to understand where the company's going. The CIO needs to understand that and have a vision of where technology standards are going, where the organization is going, and think ahead enough so you can have a system that's flexible enough that it will adapt with the changes, as opposed to letting everyone do what they want to do from the bottom up, and then ultimately the company gets too big and unwieldy. You got systems that don't work together well. Okay, enterprise, the key word here is enterprise for ERP. It's meant to integrate data and support all the major functions of the organization. Now that's different from systems that pre-existed ERP systems, because before ERP systems you may have different applications resident in different functions with their own databases, their own data, their own procedures. An ERP system is different in that the database is common, but each function is supported by an application that's one of many modules that plug into this ERP system. So you have ability to share data that you didn't before. Here's an example of what this looks like. You have different modules at the bottom here, like human resource management, finance, accounts receivable, accounts payable. These are the applications. And they're different modules, not separate applications. There's GUI tools that enable access to these modules. And the ERP system has a common database that allows you to share data between these modules. And it's great for the CEO because you can get a more holistic view of what's going on. Okay. Another key word is across an organization. Most traditional organizations are hierarchical, they're functional, they can be stovepiped, that you see your boss and you see your subordinate, but you don't interact much with other functions. The ERP system is more of a horizontal structure that's intended to cut across the different functions in an organization, and by doing so allows more collaboration, working together, sharing of data, making better strategic systems. Now, ERP originally evolved out of inventory management and control, and actually before this, you have accounting systems that were typically separate. But it's very complicated to manage inventory and control. If you've taken an operations management course, trying to determine how much inventory you need, forecasting for the future, what's the optimum ordering levels, how often do you need to order, that's complicated. And so inventory management and MRP helps you to do that much easier. But then when you think about it, if you're managing your inventory control, you're ordering components, you're also releasing components to the floor and shipping it, you're doing things that touch your income statement, balance sheet, all the financials, so it makes sense to integrate financials into this. But then you have other aspects of the operation that integrate within the finance. So if you start from this function, you realize that materials planning, although important, doesn't stand on its own. It integrates with other functions in the company. And so as MRP became more common in use, the idea or the vision of what the software should do expanded. Instead of thinking of managing this particular function, inventory, material controls management. The thinking became, well, since this is integrated in so many different areas of the organization, we should have a system that cuts across all functions with a common database. And that's where we've been since the 2000s. Okay, so another key word in Chapter 1 is processes. That it's understood that the mature management of a business is management by process as opposed by individual heroics. And the enterprise resource planning system inherently has processes contained in it. There's certain data you have to enter, certain things you have to do before something can get done and get recorded in your financial module, or before you can hire a person. So really, the ERP system is an embodiment of the processes of your business. So this leads to a third point on this slide. When you're implementing ERP systems, you have to think about, do you think your processes are so good that you want to maintain them, and then get an ERP system and force the ERP system to use the processes you developed, or change your business processes to match the functionality of the software? There's advantages or disadvantages of both. If you want to keep your own, they better be good. But if you use the ERP system and change your processes accordingly, you may find that ERP companies, they work with a lot of other companies. They're exposed to best practices. So by adopting the processes in an ERP system, you may find that it helps your business move toward better practices than what you have. Also, if you use the processes with no change, little to no change, and then implement it, there's a learning curve. But on the other hand, when updates are available, you can integrate those updates nearly automatically. However, if you have a highly custom solution that's designed to take advantage of your processes, then it's a problem. You cannot get those updates right away. What is in an ERP system? Hardware, software, information, processes, procedures, policies. They're embedded into the system. Now, another key word here is people, that people are part of the information system. An information system is an extension of the humans that use it, and you see a lot of this in the literature of socio-technical systems theory, or STS, that show how you cannot ignore the role of people, especially when you're implementing it. And here's where people pop up again. It is an integral part of the ERP. If you look at the components of the ERP system and how it's integrated, you have hardware at the bottom, the operating system that manages the hardware, the common database, you've got the ERP system and its associated modules, and then you have the user. Okay, ERP system, I'll highlight here that flexible architecture is best, or at the very least, you need to think about where things are going in the future. CIOs and directors of IT in the company, they are probably where they are today because they made the right choices on their ERP system. Here's another view of the logical architecture of the ERP system. You see the client interface and end users. You see the individual modules, the functional business applications in terms of modules, the core logic, security and access, and then the data. And this is what is different. If you're going to draw this from the perspective of legacy systems, there, 30 to 50 years ago, there may not have been a piece of software for each function, not for every function, and those that did exist did not have this data rectangle cutting across all functions. Each had its own data source, and so you had to print out spreadsheets or reports in order to get to that data and collate them, and it was tougher to interpret them. Here's an example of the tiered architecture example of an ERP system. Presentation logic, that's what end users see. There's the business logic, load balancing, application servers, batch servers, print servers, the data tier, the different database servers. Now, e-business is related to ERP in a way. E-business, you have communication, collaboration, marketing and promotion, e-commerce. So what you have in e-business is really development of applications that disrupted how business gets done, whereas ERP is more about sharing information and integrating databases across multiple functions instead of traditional hierarchical companies. It allows you to work more horizontally, because let's face it, when a company delivers a product to a customer, it's not delivering the result of one function. Like if you buy an iPad, you're not going to buy just the software, and you're not going to buy just the case. You're going to buy the product in its totality, which is something that's arrived at by the collaboration of multiple functions in the company. There's lots of benefits of an ERP system. Consistency of the user interface. It also enforces common processes across the organization. But it is very complicated to install and configure and maintain. And I mentioned to you, a story years ago that I was involved in an Oracle implementation. This was a company that had two main operations that were acquired. One operation they both had MRP systems at the time. One used IBM DataWorks system. The other used something called Man, which is an MRP system by HP. It was decided, since the two operations tended to do things differently because of the processes embedded in those two MRP systems, it was far better to implement a common solution across the entire company. That way we could take advantage of best practices, we would all be on the same page. But lots of problems in implementing it, getting people involved. Instead of 1.5 years and $3 million, it was 3 years and $7 million. And at the end of the day, instead of having a common system that worked the same everywhere, one operation that used DataWorks had an Oracle implementation that looked and functioned a lot like the old one, whereas the other operation, same thing. So it's really as if nothing changed. You just spent a lot of money and had a lot of time. So you have to really think through how you're going to get the system to adapt to an ERP system. Information sharing helps collaboration between units, and it certainly helps the CEO be more efficient in setting strategic direction. You're going to have to retrain employees, and one thing to remember with an ERP system, you sell the ERP to your employees about how wonderful it's going to make doing business, but you're going to find out that things get a lot worse before they get better, because there is a big learning curve, and no one wants to fool with it until you've cut over to the new system and they have no choice but to learn the new system. And you see productivity drop, and then it eventually returns. Now there's a life cycle for implementing this. You really need to think through the requirements of your system, plan it out, implement it, and you may do it in multiple releases. Notice you have year 1 through year 8. So it takes a long time. Like ERP is not something that's done in a month. It may take a year or two, and you have multiple releases that follow it. Implementation methodology is very structured. You have to really do your homework on gathering the requirements, and guess what? Requirements are not necessarily just what the end users say they want. It's what they need, and that may go unsaid, and it requires a lot of vetting and of what the end users say. You have to design the system, build and test it, implement it, stabilize it, and support it. This is a non-trivial exercise. And here's a different view of the product life cycle that you can read about. You have project preview, design and gap analysis. A lot of this gap analysis is involved in looking at where your system is today, where you would like it to go, and then determine how the new system is going to fulfill that vision. Then you have to do your homework in selecting the software and vendors. You want someone who's very experienced, and you also want someone who's financially stable, because you don't want to implement them and then find a couple years later they're no longer in business, and then you're stuck. So you have to understand what they can do for you. You have to think about upgrades, the cost, do some site visits, think about the plan they have for implementation and cut over. A lot of complexities. What's the total cost of ownership, for example? For example, you could pay a lot of money for a proprietary system, or try to use an open source system, like a Linux-based system, and try to roll your own. But you also have to think about, even though the license to a software or an operating system could be no charge, it's very expensive to upgrade and maintain. And if you're going to do that yourself, you're going to have a staff of software developers on hand for many years to come. So total cost of ownership is something you need to step back and consider, because it may not be obvious. You may see a big number on one side and a low number on the other, and at the end of the day you may be comparing apples and oranges. When you go live, expect a lot of problems and complaints. Project management is one of the tools used to implement it, and you've got three major things that you manage: your resources, your time, the scope. And one of the reasons the project I'm familiar with had so many issues is because the scope changed considerably over time. Often an ERP system will require external consultants to come in. They are very expensive. And they also have a vested interest in billings, so however long it takes you is really not as much of a concern to them as it is to you, because the longer consultants are with you, the more they're going to bill you. You have to think about how you'll manage change, how you'll change processes, how you're going to get people involved. Here's just an example of a number of ERP systems that are out there. You can read more details about each one of these in the text, but this is just for your reference. So I guess to sum up, ERP system is very complicated, but it solves a problem of having separate applications and data partially implemented throughout an organization, and you're moving to a comprehensive system that allows sharing of data, and instead of separate applications you've got different modules, and all of those modules have practices embedded and processes embedded that if you follow, maybe you have the opportunity to employ best practices that you may not have been aware of before, because it's embodied in the software. So choosing wisely on what vendor you select for ERP is going to be important. So that's an overview of Module 1. I encourage you to read through it yourself, but I thought I'd do a quick briefing to give you an overview of what's in store for Module 1. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you in the discussion forums.